I'm delighted that both of them could join us. Sumakshi Singh is based in Delhi, but currently residing and painting in Goa. And Ayesha Sultana is based in Dhaka, Bangladesh, but is currently in Kolkata, where she's presenting the new body of work titled Bare Bones at Experimental Gallery. Both Sumakshi and Ayesha, along with Prabhavathi Meppayil and late Lala Rukh, are the 4 artists in the ongoing exhibition Line, Beats and Shadows at KNMA Saket. This exhibition is one of the 3 exhibitions that come together under the umbrella title Scripting Time, Memory, Ecology. It has Zarina's solo on the lines of a retrospective, Homes I Made, A Life in 9 Lines, and Abstracting Nature, alluding to the organic materiality and drawings and etchings of Mrinalini Mukherjee and Jayashri Chakravarti's works. Prabha is looking after her mother who is unwell and was unable to join us this evening. While curating these exhibitions, there have been memorable moments and realizations that I shall cherish for very long, especially certain resonances that echo through the spaces inhabited by these 7 women artists. One is moved entering these spaces of silence and with a pronounced meditative aesthetics, but equally taken by their intimate and intense processes of working. The artist's hand at work, cutting, folding, unfolding, drawing, painting, kneading, collaging, staining, molding, coating, rubbing, piercing, the material and mediums they decide to work with. These workings form rhythms, repetitions, and patterns. Their practices converge, diverge, but there is always somewhere a meeting point, a common thread that runs through all 3 exhibitions. For instance, their preference and indulgence with drawing, with lines, and their investigations into drawing and what it can do for them. A certain beat of rhythm, repetition, and after images seems an organizing principle, and certainly a meditation on shadows and a desire for light. With an intergenerational representation of women artists, this exhibition for me also explores the possibility of developing a new discourse on South Asian abstraction, bringing together, to start with, 4 artists from the subcontinent. Both Sumakshi and Ayesha's engagement with architectural forms, city and built environment is an important curatorial thematic here and connects rather well and beautifully with Zarina's theme of home, displacement, loss of home, migration, anxieties of belonging and unbelonging, against the backdrop of the trauma of partition and the separation of a close-knit family. Having said that, I do want to emphasize that this is a rather limited reading into both Sumakshi and Ayesha's practice, which has a larger breadth. This conversation aims to broaden the discourse by listening to them talk about where and how they began making art, some projects from their past that have been significant to them, and what have their preoccupations been thus far in their artistic practice. You may notice that both have responded to site specificity, site-initiated and architecture-inspired projects, and equally engaged interiority and emptiness in their work. I'm delighted to welcome both Sumakshi and Ayesha to this conversation, and without wasting any more time, go straight to Ayesha. Welcome, Ayesha.
Thank you, Roobina.
Can we have the images, please? I'm just going to run through a few images from the exhibition that is currently on at KNMA. Each room was a project, and each gallery room was a project given to these artists. Lala Rukh, you can see this is Lala Rukh's room. The twilight of many suns that she captured across the continent. The seascapes and the sun. Next. Prabhavathi. Sumakshi. Ayesha. You would notice that it's very interesting how Aisha studied in Lahore. She went from Bangladesh to Lahore at the Beacon House National University. And it would be interesting to ask her about how she began her practice or what was the impact of the curriculum that she encountered there. Next, please. Yeah, Aisha, to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Roobina, and the team at KNMA and everyone else who is listening in to this evening's conversation. I'd like to start with a very early work. This is actually a part of a painting installation that I did around the time that I was graduating at BNU in 2007. Before that, prior to that, I was doing a lot of photography. For some time, I thought I would do my major in photography rather than painting. And I was also drawing. I remember making these watercolor drawings of the human figure and also in kind of interior spaces with figures in them. Usually there would be like couples or like, yeah, in different kinds of positions. But slowly over time, like around the time that I graduated, I made these, like there were these 4 paintings from this body of work. And I was taking photographs of my friends and other people around me in Lahore, like from the university or some, people I came upon, I would find like they had an interesting body type or interesting face. And I'd put them in different situations. Like some of the paintings would be I would use Photoshop to manipulate the images before I would finally paint them. So I would also take time, like a few months, to paint on these surfaces. So it was like, while I was also photoshopping the images, like I would also like kind of edit out parts of the painting, like, I don't know, like a film or a video. So that process was interesting for me. And this scene is actually like a flyover in Dhaka. I took this picture many years ago as a while I was a student, when I went back home during the summer. And the 2 figures are, they were my close friends while I was a student at BNU. Each painting also had these neon signage in front. There were usually text like a word or like a fraction of the title. And the titles would sometimes come from poetry of a friend of mine. So it's sort of also, it was also just to kind of build a narrative around around these figures, young people, or like what was happening in the scene.
And this neon is outside the painting.
It was suspended just like a foot away from the painting. I mean, while I was doing it, I was concerned whether like it would affect the painting over a period of time, but up until now, I haven't heard any complaints, so it's fine. So yeah, sure.
Can we go to the next one?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
So after I finished my undergrad, I got into teaching at Beacon House National University, and there was a period like after like studying for 4 intense years, there was it came to a moment where I felt like, okay, like now what? So I got into teaching, and then there was a period where I wasn't really making or like creating much, but I also got into teaching, like assisting and teaching a couple of courses. So that was also kind of really something new, and I had to give a lot of time to that. So I don't know, like, I think like now that I look back, like some of the watercolor drawings that I'd made with the interior spaces and the tiny figures in them, like somehow they also come back in these works, or even now, like when I think of space, like psychologically charged spaces. So these were photographs. So after my graduation, I started taking photographs of like places of transience, like petrol pumps or like train stations, etc. And I've also like this idea of death, and like has also been something that's, I think, been hovering in my practice, or like my way of thinking. So I took photographs of these. I also did a series of these sleeping bodies around the city. This was in Karachi, while I was doing a student residency at Basel. And so, yeah, the sleeping figures remind, like, they also kind of look like corpses to me. So, yeah, so I just wanted to, I sort of including a couple of photographs because I feel like that's also a very important component in my practice.
It's very interesting that you had Salima Hashmi, Huma Mulji, Rashid Rana, and many others when you joined the university there. And I'm sure there must have been some impact of the way the visual curriculum was taught, in the sense that you did not do only painting or sculpture and those kinds of distinctions. Were they there because you were already doing photographs and collaging and doing many other kinds of things already in 2004, 5, 6?
Yeah, I mean,
Is that, can you expand a little bit on that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the visual arts program, it was more interdisciplinary. We had to take electives, and even if we had a major, like from our third semester onwards, which is our second year, first semester, we were like on our own. Like we had fine art studios, so we had to kind of start thinking and kind of do things more independently, and of course under the guidance of some of our tutors. So I think that was also very crucial. Like there was no kind of segregation or like, you know, like hard distinction. Okay, if it's a painting class, you have to, you know, paint with paint, you know, or so I remember like I would really enjoy some of my drawing courses as well. So yeah, that kind of, it was more free flowing, and our professors were also very encouraging, and many of them were, you know, practicing while teaching. I think that was also kind of inspiring for us, for me especially.
Can we go to
So
the next one?
sure, next slide, please.
This is a work I really like. Can you talk a little bit about this project?
Yes, sure. This is actually jumping forward quite a few years later in
I see.
2014.
Okay.
This was, I feel like this is one of my most significant works. This was part of a public art project called 1 Square Mile by Brito Arts Trust. It's the alternative artist collective from Bangladesh. And so it was a big group of artists, photographers, and filmmakers. And we were asked to select any area or space within this demarcated area of Old Dhaka. So I came upon this locale, which is right by the spice market in Shambajar. And this little area was kind of tucked away. It's an old residential structure which was owned by 5 brothers. The place was known as Pach Bari. And of course, the residents were no longer living there, but the place was also used for religious ceremonies and pujos and things like that. So I found it really interesting. It was an open courtyard of sorts with these, beautiful arches and columns. You could see the detail, and it was also right by the banks of the Buriganga, Buriganga River. So I think what I did was I gilded the running cracks as you can see in the detail. So, those like kind of organic, I tried to kind of, make an attempt to draw a connection with the river itself, the organic nature of the water. So, and this was like a one-day exhibition. And after the exhibition was over, like I went back a few times, and it was also interesting to see like how the work also disintegrated over a period of time, or kind of think about the life cycle of the work, or how it, how the gold leaf interacted or reacted with the moisture and the oxygen over a few weeks, months, and then kind of just.
Could you also get a sense of how it was received by viewers or people who saw it?
I kept hearing like subtle, the word subtle a lot.
Okay.
Or some people had actually even missed it. Like there was, my name was on the left corner, and people didn't know what it was or like whose work it was. So I think because in the same area, there was like on the other side of the courtyard, there was another installation of an artist. There were these big ice cubes, which also kind of, melted away. So that was also kind of a time-based piece. So that work, I think, I think more, I don't know, while I was there, more audience were, I guess, interacting with that piece. This was in some way, a bit quieter in some sense.
Next, please.
Next slide, please.
Yeah, can we see the details here? Yeah. Yeah, can you tell us something about,
Yeah, I just...
We're going back 2010, okay.
Yes, going back 4 years.
Okay.
I wanted to include this. This is also from an exhibition that I did, group exhibition that I did with Brito. And I wanted to include this, they're stills from a video that are pictured here on the slide. So I was going to Dholaikal, which is the scrap metal yard in Old Dhaka, and taking footage in the early mornings of the place and its marketplace. It's a market that sells like old machinery and automobile parts. And I remember I would keep the camera on a tripod and just let it run. And the frames would almost be like, when you watch the whole video, the frames are almost like a still photograph with very slow movements in light, or changes, or of something like flying across the screen, or an insect or something. So just kind of, I thought I could just include this to, think of like how I was thinking of space or form and texture and all these different
and sometimes
elements.
Also, sometimes one comes across such unintentional geometries that come in front of us. You just frame them and you see a lot of things that come later in your work, sharp edges and precision.
Or like metal.
Yeah, metal and
repetition.
Sharpness. Very interesting, yes.
Could we go to the next slide?
Scratch photograph, okay. Tell us about this.
This one is titled Threshold, and it's a body of work that has mostly photographs that I had collected from family albums, like specifically taken by my father. And I had worked on this after my father had passed, a few years after my father had passed away. And many of these images are actually from his travels and also while he was in service with the Bangladesh Air Force. And then I also included some of my own photographs within these. We could go to the next slide. And I kind of treated the surface of the paper. I would like leave them out in the sun, or I would use glue or scratch them or sometimes cut them up. So around this time, I was also drawing a lot. So these are also like, this seem to be like, I don't know, drawings to me. Yeah, sort of capturing moments in time. This is the Kuwait Tower. We lived in Kuwait for a few years in the right up until the Gulf War. So this specific structure has a lot of memories. So I thought I could include this in the presentation today.
Are these large in size?
No, the photographs, they're all like 3.5 by 5 inches, or roughly, small.
I see.
They're small. They're the original photographs. I didn't print them.
Okay. Okay.
Maybe we could go to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. These are all sculptures from 3 different exhibitions.
Sorry, this image is getting cut, but the lower one, we
I
can't see.
can see all of it actually.
You can? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
On the top right is older. It's an older piece from 2013. It's called Tabula Rasa, and I was interested in this. It recalls the dome of the Pantheon. I had spent some time in Rome and working with an artist over there, and I would visit this ancient temple quite often. It was very inspiring for me. So I also like the oculus of the structure was very, very interesting, how the light kind of would pass through, and every time I would visit, at different points in the day, it would have a different kind of atmosphere, ambience through that circular structure, dome. And the other sculptures, they're all made of wood. The image to the left with the black sculpture is made in brass, but the rest of the works are all in wood. And before I made these sculptures, I actually worked on a series of drawings called form studies, and which I also which also got published with Experimenter Books. And they're all each drawing is actually like an idea for a sculpture. So these are 3D manifestations of from those drawings that I made and was shown in different exhibitions.
So what do you think was happening in these years, that when you were coming to these forms or these objects? Because through these few slides, one understands that you have interest in the fragment, you have interest in the ruin, you have interest in the wreckage, you are looking at cracks and crevices, and insignificant details catch your eye, and then you really work on those. In at least in some of those early works, that was visible. I'm very interested also in the way that you have done this work, which is on the Pantheon, which is like just a slice of it, and really shows the interior or shows the inside of it with the patterns that come about. What is the material and what was happening? What were you trying to do?
The material is wood, and it has these metal small structures to hold it at the back, but it's mostly wood.
Okay,
I actually made this for a solo show
I see.
in Rome.
Mm,
So, like
okay.
after coming back, after you know working and living in Rome for about a year, after I returned, I went back with works, showed works that were actually inspired by my time in Rome, where
Okay.
so that was also a period I would say like sort of like a gestational period where I wasn't making a lot of work as I was also like assisting another artist, but I was doing other things, like I was sketching a lot. I was visiting all these old buildings, churches. So I think I felt like I was absorbing a lot during that time. So this piece was from that period.
Do you also feel that certain kind of inclination towards geometry and geometric abstraction had started or had entered your work because you see something in the lower image as well, where you
Yeah.
are working with very sharp edged triangles and forms which really are precise and have some kind of repetition as well as a very clear clarity of image, so to say. Can we go ahead and see what is
Yeah,
happening?
sure.
Maybe
Let's
the next
go to the
slide.
next slide.
Yeah, okay.
Um,
This might explain what is happening here.
Yeah. This is a project that I really enjoyed working on called A Space Between Things. It was commissioned for the Dhaka Art Summit. This was in 2016, at the 2016 Dhaka Art Summit exhibition.
Yes, I did
And
see.
okay, that's great.
Yeah.
So it was a solo project where I had this space, this room where I was working on, while I was making these, I was working on them like individually, like if we could go to the next slide.
Next, please.
Okay, maybe not. We could go back to the previous slide, please.
Yeah.
So the suspended iron structure, that was one of the earlier pieces that I made, and then slowly other things came about. And once I installed the show, it felt like it was one body of work, one unified body of work. And I was interested in how they were creating relationships between, like among them, and also I was thinking about like the body in space or how you navigate a space. So some of these materials I've used are actually like building materials. Like the floor is a work in itself. There are cement tiles,
Yeah.
and then there's iron, there's glass, there's brass. So I wanted to explore. I don't have a sculpture background myself, but I still wanted to explore different kind of mediums, and just kind of play around with it and have fun. Also, while I was installing, I wanted to create a certain rhythm, like I said, and how you would navigate the space. So that interaction, whether it's the audience like coming in and walking on those tiles itself, those
Yeah.
kind of interactions were very important to me. Can we go to the next slide?
It also does something to the vantage point, when you enter this space, there are different kinds of experiences and different kinds of materials surrounding the viewer.
Yeah.
So that became very interesting, how one would really navigate the space. What do you do? Do you bend down? Do you go straight? I mean, how do you bypass something and go there and see it from the other side? And so there was this, it wasn't frontal in that sense.
Yeah.
And that kind of exploration of space was very interesting, that it was not what one usually expects. It goes beyond the expected and the anticipated, when you enter a
Yeah.
space like this.
Yeah, I
um,
would
yeah.
definitely like to expand on this body of work. This is an air filter. I had collected
Yeah,
several of
your,
them from the scrap metal yard, and yeah, so this is sort of like
part
a
of it.
yeah, autobiographical kind of a piece, I would say. Yeah, next slide, please.
Yeah.
For this piece, I was actually like, I was looking at these electric rubber pipes that shut out from the ground, these colorful pipes. So I had taken like photographs of them over a period of time. So this work was thinking of that form and kind of, you know, transforming it into another material. But it sort of became something else. It became like it had its own like life, and from my original thinking.
It also looked like drawings or lines suspended in space, you know, they just come out, but they really have a very strong linearity, you know, in the way you look at it. This is something that comes later in your work also, where you work with the deception of
Okay.
material. Next, please. Okay, we are already here. This is, of course, at the museum, and you can talk about this body of work because I think it has come together very well. And I think I would like you to talk a little bit about your drawings here and the work called Breath Count.
Okay,
Because
sure.
you narrated a very interesting anecdote along with it. And I think we can go through the details. If this is, of course, a exhibition view, but part exhibition view. But next one, maybe we can go to details.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a nice
yeah.
installed view. The works in this particular room, they're actually made at different points in time. I believe between 2015 to 2018. And yeah, they're all works on paper. They're all drawings. If we could go to the next slide, see a detail.
Yeah.
This is from a series called Fragments, Untitled Fragments. When I had started this body of work, I was actually looking at like windows and like also kind of composing it on the sheet of paper as windows or little frames. I was looking at different kinds of kind of patterns and jalis as well. But over time, it also kind of became more and more stripped down with the kind of patterns I was making in each drawing. Go to the next slide.
Yes.
Yeah, because sometimes like an ornate window or a window frame was, I would just take like one element from that and, or change the pattern.
There are some very interesting gradations of tones as well, you know, in the work.
Yeah, it's
graded. It's
yeah, it's all it's gouache and ink.
Okay.
They're mostly gouache and ink.
Are they hand drawn? May I ask what is happening here in terms of?
Yes, they're all hand drawn, and sometimes, not sometimes, I would actually like, you know, pencil out the drawing itself, and then I would go over it with gouache or ink washes, depending on each kind of composition. And next slide, please.
Yeah.
There's also a personal body of work. It's called Breath Count, and this work is actually about many things, but it's also about slowing down and kind of getting
Yes.
into an introspective kind of mind, and also like to do with breathing or following your breath, or kind of,
Yeah.
yeah, making, yeah, sort of like following your breath and making those marks onto the paper by removing the layer of the paper. They're all clay coated paper, and I was using these scratch tools to make various types of marks onto the paper.
So you were actually emptying the coating, isn't it, to make the mark? You're taking away to create
Yeah,
a trace, or to
yeah,
create a mark, so to say.
yeah. It's an act
Beautiful.
of removal, or
And tell us a little bit about why breath count.
so it's a personal work, and I have a lung condition for which I have this dry cough all year round. It's been there for many years. So I thought, yeah, so this, I think around the time when I was first making these works, I was not doing very well. And like I mentioned, it was a way of kind of slowing down my pace. And for some of these drawings, I would just sit and sort of work over the drawing, try to work over it at one stretch, if I could. For some, there would be pauses, and then I would come back to it. Even those pauses are actually quite evident in the
Right.
drawings if you look closely with the way the flow of the mark is going.
Somewhere there is also a sense of exhaustion, I feel.
Perhaps, yeah,
Yeah, because breathing can do that.
yeah,
There's a normal breathing, but there can be exhaustion. There can be very different kinds of experience of breathing,
fatigue.
and people have been in the pandemic experiencing a lot of uh, have been thinking more about breath. And it's such, and the economy of breath is very interesting. We don't notice it, that we are inhaling and exhaling all the time. We only come to that, we get alert when we find that something is wrong with it, and one has difficulty, or one is feeling exhausted, or one is breathless. And you told me at that time when I spoke with you that you also had to relocate from Dhaka, isn't it? Because of the air
Yeah,
quality and
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I relocated with my husband in Sylhet, in his ancestral home. It's in northeast part of Bangladesh, and we lived there for about 10, 11 months, and yeah, it was, for the most part, it was a very quiet and peaceful, um, you know, period over the from the last few years that I've been working. So it was also a very different way of living. I think, like, I had very different kind of daily rituals, and it's also, the environment was completely like, there's a stark difference from city life, and also sort of going to moving to a smaller town. It was close to a river, so yeah, and so the air was obviously much clearer, and that definitely helped in some ways.
So in the last few years, Delhi is doing that to me, where I get allergic cough and lose my voice often. Like I didn't have a voice till yesterday. I've managed to somehow, but and the doctor just tells you to rest your voice. So as you talked about resting, pausing, slowing down, and keeping, I think, and silence, I think, become ways of rejuvenating and getting your breath back in a way. So this work is very close to me. I see it almost every time that I go into that room and sit in front of it. It's really it has silence, but it also moves you in different ways. Next, please. Okay, we come to your most celebrated works, I would say, until now. tell us something about how you came to this, working on graphite with metallic powder.
Can we go to the next slide?
Okay, we go to the next slide first.
And
Oh, there is still
maybe
this.
there's another one.
Yeah.
There's another slide of a drawing. If we could go to the next slide. Yeah,
Okay.
you can stay there. While I was making the series of photographs, and not series, I had shown only 2 images from the threshold body of work, the photographs. So I mentioned that I was also making a lot of drawings, different types of drawings during this time period. So these drawings were initially like very small paper constructions, kind of geometric paper constructions. And I was making drawings like I was filling up sheets of paper with ballpoint or ink or other kinds of materials. I also had graphite powder, so I was also covering up surfaces with that. And then I made these. What I found interesting is also I do take a lot of photographs, and I was taking photographs of these corrugated like boundary walls and tin roofing. So I wanted to sort of, for one of the drawings, I wanted to create these folds on the paper. And I think that was an early inspiration. I was making these kinds of small geometric constructions, looking at like kind of architectural spaces. And yeah, the early graphite works are more raw in a sense. They were also assembled differently, like it was assembled onto plywood. I didn't know actually how to even, what type of adhesive to use, so some of them would also get damaged. So yeah, so the inspiration actually came from geometry.
And you're layering the paper,
The process,
coating it.
before, earlier on, I would actually make the construction first and then treat the paper, like coat it with powder and then graphite, find these thick graphite sticks. So there were multiple layers, and then I would fix it and then add more, depending on like the kind of density or richness I wanted the surface to have. And I would like make the constructions, like cut out the paper and then layer it, but then later it became more and more difficult to make the folds. So then I reversed the process. I would layer the paper first and then make the folds and make the compositions. So they're inspired from architecture, and like this particular one is also kind of looking at kind of like Islamic geometry, or like these kind of lattice work. Like the first image that was on the slideshow called Constellation, that work.
Yes.
That was also like a work I made for an exhibition. So they also come from. They come from different.
What is the most challenging thing here? It seems like
it takes a lot of time because there are different stages. You need to give it. It needs a certain kind of attention, and I need to really get into that zone because it's also paper, and it's it can be sensitive. Like there can be stains or marks, and sometimes I leave it as is, but sometimes I need to like discard it and then work on it again. So
Most viewers who walk in think it's metal, by the way.
Yeah, it's
Because it has that shimmer and it has that sheen and it looks like metal. So it's you've actually treated it in a way that it carries that kind of weight. Okay, it has that gravity and precision, sharpness, edge, everything. And it's very interesting. You've used paper, which can be quite vulnerable when it comes to cuts and pieces and folding, unfolding, assembling, and then having the precision of edges meeting, which is something that is very, very challenging here. I've seen in works where you have assembled many more pieces, like the one that I showed at the beginning, a very long piece, and everything needs to then fall in place for it to look like one,
unified
one unified
right
piece.
surface.
I find it extremely remarkable the way that you have created these works, and I'm sure they demand time, but they also demand a lot more, in terms of your effort, in terms of precision, in terms of exactness, in terms of how you would even grade the layers of the powder that you are layering on it.
Yeah,
Create these kinds of modulations, so to say.
yeah, I mean, it also, like in the first image of the work Constellation, I had used different types of graphite powder and also different gradations, like a 2B graphite stick and a 6B graphite stick. So some of them also have these different kind of variations of grays in them. So I like those little details in the work.
Next, please. So you really push the limits of abstraction in these graphite works, I feel, and in the exhibition, I feel that when I was curating that room, it wasn't easy. It looks as if it can be easy to put those works together, but they demand their own space and their own space around them as well, to really put them together is quite challenging. But once they were there, I really loved the feel of this monochromatic room, where you had a room which had just the blacks and the whites and the grays. But you're not someone who is just doing monochrome works. And it's very interesting to see your recent exhibition, which brings us to bare bones. And I'm keen to hear from you. What have you done in this recent body of work? And
Yeah,
what are your
just
preoccupations? Yeah.
I before we go to the images of this current show,
Yeah.
I wanted to just include this this piece called Breath. This was done, actually it was done in 2018, yeah, it's fine.
Yeah.
I did a residency at Bella's Artist Projects in Bataan, in the Philippines. And some of the works from the residency was shown in a group show. To the left is actually a tile piece by Rana Begum. That's not my work, but I just wanted to point out the work on the wall, which, again, they're looking at the sky and they're screen prints. Each of them are screen prints. And my idea was actually to make a book like out of these screen prints. I spent a lot of time looking up and looking outside the tile workshop where I spent most of my time during this residency period, just to bring us back to the current show. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
I'm also actually in the gallery space right now.
Yes.
So there's some paintings behind me.
So these are paintings.
They're all paintings. I had done some paintings, while I was a student and also after my graduation a little bit, but there was like a long break. So this is my way of sort of tiptoeing back to painting in some ways. So this exhibition is titled Bare Bones, and I wanted to sort of, again, like go down to the elements, to what I was trying to say. This body of work was also made in like over like a 5 or 6 week period of time. Next slide, please. It's still very new. It's still very new to me. This is the same room where I'm seated right now. So it's while I was making these works, I was going through a lot. Like I was kind of, the work is quite personal. I was processing grief. I was, it talks about many different things like that I had experienced over the last few months. Next slide, please. So there are some paintings which are looking at like, I'm just calling them, I haven't titled the works yet, some of them, like the clouds over there, so I'm just going to call them the cloud series. And there are two paintings of the water to the left. It's a diptych of sorts. Next slide, please.
It's very interesting to see the shift towards the organic, from the geometric, that abstraction that we were looking at in the graphite works. And here there is some looseness about it. There's some lucidity, and it's going back to the sea, the sky, the spaces beyond just the architectural spaces that were inspiring, or this looking beyond the city in one sense.
Yeah.
Would you
sort of
talk a little bit about it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of like going back to nature. There's one room, I don't think I have an image of that. Maybe if we could just check the next slide. Or maybe no, we can go back to the previous
Go
one.
back.
So there's a room which has paintings of, all the paintings have the palette green. So I'm like looking at foliage and leaves. And
Oh,
like,
yes.
so it's also kind of, I was recalling like the structure of the body and trying to draw relations with that. And there's some other small board paintings which
Yes.
are looking at the bark of a tree, or like thinking about like skin, or like, the quality of skin, the membrane of sorts. So yeah, the water, it's interesting that you mentioned organic, but as also while I was making these paintings, I was thinking about pattern within the waves of the river. And if we could go back to the previous slide, sorry, previous one.
One more, please. Yeah.
Oh gosh.
This is beautiful. Is this the one that you were mentioning?
Yeah, so each of these paintings have a different title. There are different times or night, like times of the day or night. And a couple of them have direct photographic reference. While I was painting them, for some of these kind of color spectrums, I had descriptive notes that I used for the works. So yeah, I mean, in a way, this body of work was also kind of very freeing for me to to be using color in a way. It was actually also a joyful experience. So I do plan to paint more. So this was sort of like a warm-up exercise for me. Next slide, please. The next one. I think you wanted to include this image, Roobina.
Yes, I did want to, because I just traveled in Uttarakhand and I found many such structures over there, which looked vulnerable, and yet they were inhabited by people. They were open to sun and air and light, and also open to risk of being in such cluttered open spaces, because there were people living there, and without windows and doors. And this painting really came to my mind when I was, because I'd seen your walk through at Experimenter, and it stayed with me. So I was keen to know about this, because it has these cells, it has repetition, it has its rhythm, but it also has what often comes in your work, this whole the vulnerability of things. It has that feeling that it can collapse, it can just come down on the ground. So I'd like to hear from you what because this is in one sense a link between those works where there is a pronounced geometry, and then your movement to looking at nature and foliage and sun and water and sky. So would you like to say something about this work, because it does appeal to me in very strange ways. I go back to it. I've seen it a couple of times before this presentation also. Yeah.
Okay. I actually stumbled upon this building just a month or two ago in Dhaka. It's in one of the busier parts of the city, right by a railway track. And what I found interesting was like there are these small, tiny spaces that were inhabited by people at some point, and they're all like these colored, the walls have these different colors. And so this building was going to be demolished, and but the structure, like in that row of buildings in that area strip, this was the only building that didn't have a face, or like a front was completely exposed, sort of similar to that work Rupture, the site specific
Yes.
work, where you see the innards of the architectural space. So I think that's what I found interesting. And I did, like you mentioned, with the shapes and the repetition. And yeah, that also kind of, that also attracted me to this building.
But something has happened with the colors that you have used and the transparency of it. It's become, it's lost its weight, as if, the building. It almost looks like a ghost building. It's lost its weight and, its physicality of another kind that you have when you see a building. And that's something that I find very interesting. It's almost like it's in the sky.
Okay, yeah, I also removed much of the detail, like there were a few doors and other kind of objects, air conditioning, so I used many of the elements while I was painting it.
Is this the last slide?
I believe so. We can check. No, actually, there's one more.
Okay, next, please.
This one you also.
I juxtapose this because I'm very interested in these two kinds of realities in your work. There is one is a color patch that creates this kind of a body and volume, and the other one, which is paper, and yet looks like a metal sheet with weight and heaviness. This solidity of form, and yet being left with suspense of not being so solid. Let's put it that way. It has that feeling also that it can fall, or it can break, or it can it remains open to that feeling. Would you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure.
Because you do talk about, in your walkthrough, you talked a lot about exploration of forms.
Yeah. Like this, the drawing to the right is actually one of my early graphite pieces, and you know how I talked about my inspiration from corrugated sheets. This is a very like direct reference to that.
Yes.
And there are also two pieces of paper that are actually just you know stuck together, and mounted onto a panel. The work on the left is more recent. It's from it's a work I made last summer from a series of small paintings I made. They're all on board, and it's obviously, you can see it's more gestural, and I would just dilute the paint, and I would kind of move the panel around so that it kind of settles and, you know, makes its own, you know, like allowing chance to happen and kind of, you know, make its own composition. So that's what I really enjoyed. So, I mean, the process and the technique is obviously different in both of these pieces. And it's interesting that you mentioned weight and gravity a few times. And this idea of like things kind of falling apart or also ruin. Yeah.
Good. I'm glad that some of the works from your recent showing are now in our collection, because I think that's also a way that an artist's practice is. It's not always about the one thing that you recognize in the work or a one body of work that you recognize. And I think that is true of both you and Sumakshi, that the desire that you carry is not to become a signature style artist. You want to do different things, you explore different kinds of thematics, you explore different kinds of mediums, and you keep that terrain open for you. This creativity, you know, it's open. It's not about falling into any kind of a paradigm, you know, and that becomes very interesting. What we're going to see next from Aisha, we don't know. So that makes it even more intriguing, you know, a practice. Thank you so much, Aisha. I'm going to come back to you with some common questions at the end. So, Sumakshi, can we go to you now? Next, please. So, okay. Yeah, Sumakshi. So tell us, from Baroda, you went where? We will now come to know from one of your first projects. Next, please. Okay.
Okay, so first I just want to say it's amazing to me how many overlaps Aisha's practice and my practice has.
Yes.
I mean, we've been on two different continents and thinking about so many similar things. And unfortunately, some of those slides are not in this show, but maybe at the end we'll talk about some of that.
Yeah.
So this is a body of work that started in 2001, and it happened when I moved from Baroda, where I was doing my undergrad, to Chicago to do my master's. And you know, in Baroda, it was really common to see, like, you know, peepal trees and banyan trees like growing out of the sides of buildings, and this whole interaction between the man-made and the natural seemed really like organic. And from there, I moved to downtown Chicago, which is, you know, possibly one of the most manicured environments known to man, where you know, all the trees were the same height. You never saw a weed in the sidewalk. All the nature that I found was in boxes and rectangles. And so in a way, it felt like the landscape, the natural landscape, had been converted into some other form of architecture. And there seemed to be this kind of underlying message of human control over the natural environment. You know, and something in me wanted to, I think, like start messing with that pristine, you know, pervert that sterility of all these neat boxes and this system. The other thing that, you know, I was telling you about earlier today, which was, I still find a little uncanny, was there's this tulip season that happens in Chicago. So basically you go through months and months and months of winter where the city is completely bald and there's not a leaf on a tree and the ground is barren. And then one morning in April, you wake up and there are fully blooming tulips like all over the city, like downtown.
Yeah.
And you never saw them grow. And 2 weeks later, you wake up in the morning, they've all disappeared and you never saw them die. And, you know, someone came and dug them up in the middle of the night. And I used to find this very uncanny and strange that, you know, there's this natural cycle and then this one part of it has been isolated and presented for some kind of human consumption. And so I think that, you know, I was also somehow protesting against like the impoverishment of this value system that wanted to place value only on that climactic moment and like bypass the journey and just let's prolong the destination or that sort of immediate gratification. And so a lot of the work that I started doing while I was in Chicago started echoing this kind of, you know, like this microcosmic activity that might look like a weed growing out of a sidewalk or fungus or mushrooms growing on a wall, some kind of organic activity that hadn't necessarily been like pre-processed and packaged for human consumption. And, you know, the pieces would look almost like they're about to emerge or they're in a process of decay. So often I would use fungus and real plants in the work. So this is made out of polymer clay and they're tiny. It's about like 1.5 inches. And maybe we can go to the next slide.
Yeah.
And some of these pieces are, they intervene directly in the walls. So they're not just placed on it. And almost none of them are like at eye level. So what happens is when you look through this, what you see is a kind of like a red polymer clay cup that's holding papaya seeds, which are starting to turn color and catch mold. And there's a whole little diorama inside. But it's not really a contained pocket of activity because when you step back from it, you're looking at the slide on the right side, which is you start seeing these little holes in the wall and you start seeing these bits of wire and you start seeing a bit of moss. And then when you step back, you see more and you step back and you see more until maybe we can go to the next slide. Until basically it looks something like this, like on the left side, where everything just looks like these proliferating membranes. And it becomes really hard to figure out where a piece ends and another one begins. And so the transitional spaces between start getting eaten up in a way. And, you know, when my photographer would come to take these pictures, I mean, one standing question, he would always ask me, like, wait, where do you want the frame? I mean, is just this piece the piece, or are these holes part of the piece, or is that part of the piece? And so this whole kind of unbracketing got, you know, interesting to me in a way. And maybe we can move to the next. And, you know, I think the thing is that I also like would amplify a lot of the pre-existing flaws in this space. And if it wasn't there, I would create these. And so they become like these artificial histories of previous installations. And it would just look like a lot of scarring that was in the space sometimes. And no matter how obsessive I was about making every bump, lump, etc. on the wall, in fact, some of these have their shadows painted, the bumps have their shadows painted. So you don't really know how much is natural, how much is constructed. You know, viewers would walk in and inevitably they're going to see like this one bump on the wall, and the question kind of comes up whether, is that intentional, or is that accidental, or was that amplified, or was that forgotten about and left behind? And I mean, in other words, is that part of the art, or is that not part of the art? And that's something that I think each viewer confronts in their own minds, and they either confront a boundary or expand that boundary about whether that is allowed to become part of the work or not. And if it does, I mean, the very spending that kind of time and attention on just looking at the surface of the wall, really, it often becomes hard for people to switch that off when they leave the gallery. So I would often get calls from viewers, from their own neighborhood saying that, oh, I've just started noticing these new weeds in my neighborhood, or, this crack with beautiful fungus in it, or et cetera, et cetera. And I started to see how, the gallery could just serve as a kind of highlighter tool to, highlight maybe what was always present, but maybe not visible, like something that was in the peripheral attention, but kind of centralizing it as fragments. And shall we see the next slide?
Yeah, sure.
This show was in Zurich in Switzerland, and it's the same theme, same body of work, but I just sort of wanted to expand that crack out, and this is done with layers and layers and layers of paper. Next slide. Which I, painted and adhered together and then carved out and cut so that it literally looks like the walls are all peeling and flaking and falling apart, and this kind of erosion and time. And the next image. And this is a detail of the way that paper was arranged. And of course, there were also these sort of micro interventions dotted all over the place. And then the next slide.
Oh, beautiful.
So this was in the Museum of Contemporary Art in Lyon. And, when I moved this body of work to Europe, I mean, part of what started changing was, so I'd actually spent quite a bit of time in both France and Italy at this point, like a few years. And I had also been working with illusions and perspectives, which, we'll see one or two projects later on. But the way I was working with perspective was very much about how we see things. So it wasn't really about mathematical perspective tricks that we learned in the Renaissance, but really like, how do you just use your eyes to try and locate something? And that got me particularly fascinated in these frescoes of both the Renaissance and the pre-Renaissance period, where you see these, like just before Renaissance, they hadn't yet invented mathematical perspective. So all these figures are sort of tottering awkwardly in this kind of non-place, and the perspective is always a little bit off. And I really liked the awkwardness and the sort of in-between places, of some kind of other space that they were existing in. So I started also working with some of these art historical characters, and I made these animations with them, which were on these tiny screens, like little iPads that were embedded in the ground and also in the wall. So again, these microcosms would also have this kind of moving imagery in them. So this man is looking at that little hole in the floor, and the image of that is to the left, where you have the angel Gabriel, like a little sculpture of him, and then there's the animation where he's sort of moving around in his reflection. The next slide. And, in a sense, I think for me, the most interesting thing about this body of work is that the pieces almost become like a decoy, because people spend actually more time looking at the space between the pieces and the wall, and what was once the ground ends up becoming the figure. And there's this sort of dissolution that starts to happen between that polarity of object and image, ground and figure, the beginning and the end of a piece, that bracketing. So things start to kind of open up and, start to leak into each other's spaces. And There's also the strange dance that, people do when they come into the spaces, because you have to sort of bend your body and look here and look there. And there's a certain rhythm and movement that occurs in this space as people move through.
So it also defies a vantage point, a single vantage point. It's also a very interesting take on surface and depth in the work.
Right.
Because the surface
Right.
is there, but the depth is of a very different kind, and again, this whole idea of a up close viewing and then going back or distancing to see everything, because nothing is complete in any one place. It's not that even the pieces are not complete in themselves. They have things
Right.
all over.
It feels almost like these sort of fragments that are like scattered, and then they somehow are building into some kind of narrative, but that narrative isn't really like the sum of its parts. It's some abstract space which is holding all these fragments together, and that's where like the story is, forming. And in terms of depth, what you were saying, I think that's a point well taken, because I've had people, mention to me how just this quality of focusing onto that micro bump or lump or painting somehow made it almost portal-like, where they sort of entered a kind of world in there, and it was opening some other space for them to walk into. But
very interesting.
Maybe the next slide. Then the same show moved to Rome, and in Rome at the Maxi Museum, and this is a gorgeous museum, and it's designed by Zaha Hadid, but it's so sculpturally strong and architecturally strong. I'm saying sculpturally because the architecture literally feels like a sculpture, like you're walking through a sculpture. And there were just long curved corridors that went on from, many, many meters, and there were tilted walls. And so it was as far removed from a white cube space as, I had ever worked in. And I felt that I needed a stronger architectural intervention for this particular space. So I built this, this ceiling, this barrel vaulted ceiling that was about 56 feet long or so, and it looked, like the flaking, deteriorating frescoes of these churches with these art historical figures collaged and painted on it, and also projected and moving around. And that's me working on it. And can we see the next slide? Yeah, and then these are little details. So again, there were all these little fragments and bits and pieces of narrative all along the wall, floor. Next, please. So this was a project. This was just a really fun project that I did. In 2006, I was on residency in upstate New York. And, I had been thinking a lot about immediate gratification, and how, like I was mentioning, thinking about these flowers that were always in full bloom, and movies on demand, and any season food available anytime you want it. And I was thinking about, like, what does it do to us when, you can have anything you want whenever you want it? And if desire is sort of maybe divorced from time, like if you don't have to wait for something, if that cycle is broken and you just have that climax whenever you want it, and if you bypass the journey altogether. So I was thinking about that, and then I was thinking about I was reading The Little Prince at the time, actually, and he talks about this. He talks about how his planet is so tiny that at one point, whenever he's depressed, he just has to shift his chair and then he can see the sunset. And one day he was depressed, so he kept shifting his chair and he saw the sunset 44 times. And I loved the poetry of this idea of just being able to have this eternal sunset. But I also was thinking about it in terms of this immediate gratification thing, that if you could just always have your sunset, if you could always have this beautiful moment, what would that feel like? And so I made this piece out of fiberglass and resin to look like the reflection of an impressionist sunset on water. And this is in the Hudson Valley, which has its whole history of landscape painters as well. And then I attached it to the back of my boat, and then I rode around the river with my sunset attached to me. So like morning, noon, or night, you know. And then other people were invited to do the same. They could row around with their sunset. They could take their sunset with them. And the next slide. Yeah, that's me working on it. And the next slide. Yeah, and then finally it was just installed there in the in the lake to be a sunset on demand, so that you could come in any time of day and see a sunset. And the idea was actually, I wanted to remake this idea in colored ice, like use food coloring and do it with ice. And I was actually halfway through the project and it never quite worked out, and now it feels like the time for it is sort of gone. But I really wanted the sunset to kind of melt back finally, you know, into the water. So let's see if that reemerges or not.
Hold on. I have a question. Hold on. So all the three projects that you have shown, what is the afterlife of these works? What happens to those works that you showed us, including this sunset, beautiful sunset?
So, the sunset is probably still sitting in the garage of the residency hosts in the
Okay.
Okay. So this was 2006, and I mean, they asked me many times, you know, they're like, do you want to take it? But I mean, you know, I was a student and broke artist, and there was no way I could afford to pay for shipping a 35-foot sunset across the country to Chicago, and let alone back to India. So it's, I don't know if it's still around, frankly.
But is there anything that gets resurrected or retrieved from the previous projects?
Yes. So the micro intervention work that we were seeing earlier. So a lot of the accompanying stuff, like the plaster, the paper, that sort of gets destroyed when the show is done. Like there's nothing, you know, it gets cleaned up. But the smaller sculptural pieces, I do save them, and then they take on a new life in a new show, maybe, and new formats, and they have different lives. Yeah.
Okay. Next. What is the material? Sorry, here. Sorry, just for a moment. Can you go to the?
This was fiberglass.
Fiberglass. Okay.
It was fiberglass, which I tinted with resins and hardened with resin, and then I got different dyes for the resin and mixed them in. It was my first and last time working with resin, and that's actually why I wanted to work with the ice, is because I really, you know, it's a toxic material, and I didn't enjoy working with it, and I also felt it was sort of contradicting the whole point of the piece. Like I wanted, you know, like for me the poetry was getting a little bit ruined by the material. So that's why the color dye. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so this is actually a piece I made in 2008. It's called Mapping the Memory Mandala. And this one is linked very much to the show at the Kiran Museum right now. So we, my immediate family, which is my parents, my brother and I, we moved all over the country. My father had a transferable job, so every few years we were living in a different state, different school, all of that. And so as a result, like our sense of home as a place was always tied to my grandparents' house in Lajpat Nagar in Delhi, which is 33 Link Road. And year after year, we'd be coming back there for all our summer holidays, winter holidays. everything seemed very comfortably frozen in time. Nothing ever seemed to change in the house. You know, it was always the same upholstery.
Yeah.
I was telling Roobina earlier, like we always knew the Hajmola was going to be on the left side of the top drawer, and the cotton wool on. I mean, nothing changed. Like, you know, so there was this kind of comfort coming back to the same place year after year, knowing you're going to find everything exactly as is. And also the, you know, this drawing room space, the living room of my grandfather. You know, it had this lifetime of collected objects, and he was an amazing storyteller. And so we knew the story behind how each one of these objects came into this room, and there were spectacular stories. There was Maharajas involved, and Becks, and Czechoslovakian trips, and the mafia, and, you know, all sorts of amazing things. And so, you know, so we were really familiar with this space. And then when he died in 2006, it was a very uncanny experience for me walking through this living room of objects which I knew so well. And yet, you know, my perception of them was no longer matching up to my knowledge of what they were. And I wanted to somehow digest this gap between that knowledge and perception, like knowing what a thing is, but not being able to feel it that same way, you know? And so I basically, I drew out the illusion of his drawing room on all the objects in my studio in France at the time. So it's drawn on a chair, it's drawn on this trash can, on a canvas, on the floor, on the wall, on a jar, on a shelf, all the different objects that were there already. I didn't choose extra objects. And after a while, like the drawn illusion starts to obliterate the real object. And from the vantage point of the entrance, when you walk into the room, it actually, it looks like my grandfather's living room is there. And as you walk in, the whole illusion starts to split and fracture, because of course you moved away from that 1 inch away from that fixed vantage point, and it starts to break apart. And then as you walk in, it starts to skew and splatter until maybe the next slide. Yeah, so until you walk in, and when you're in there, it's actually a very disorienting, abstracted place you're in. But simultaneously, the viewers get to see themselves projected on a screen, and on the screen, they're actually in the lined up illusion of my grandfather's living room. So this sort of bodies start to slow down, and people are trying to, you know, usually understand the physics of like being in two places at one time, and trying to understand what the implication of an action here is going to have in that world over there. And this negotiation of being here and there happens. And then as people start to move through the space, then essentially this image of my grandfather's living room starts to kind of blur, and finally it gets erased. You know, I have the dust from it now. And so that's how it was called mapping the memory mandala, as this idea of something that, you know, then. So I think there is a little video of me mapping out. So if you go maybe up to 19 seconds on the video, it'll get rid of all the text, and then you can show parts of the video, maybe not the whole thing. It's the process of how I was mapping this illusion out.
Very interesting.
Yeah. I think the video isn't really playing at the right speed. Or
this is
and it
jumping.
doesn't have sound. But you know what I'll do? I'll just tell you a little bit about how the process was. It's a little. So basically, there was a a drawing on glass that I made of my grandparents' living room, and there was a camera placed behind it at the entrance. And whatever the camera was seeing, it was looking through that drawing into the room where I was. And whatever the camera was seeing, I could see because I'd connected it to a projector. And so I was basically running around in three-dimensional space, like with a piece of chalk, trying to trace out wherever I could see the lines, you know, on, like I would move until my chalk was lining up to that glass drawing. And so I was making a two-dimensional drawing on a three-dimensional space. But anyway, maybe we can just go towards the end of this video, because I think it's
Jump in.
it's on the website if anyone wants to see it later on sumakshi.com. So you can see the video if you want it. So basically, all these strange zigzag lines and all of the, you know, things that seem like they're quarter of a millimeter away actually go 3 meters back in space. And so it was also very interesting to me to spend time doing this, because it was, you know, really about exploring also like the mechanics of vision. Like, how do we actually see things? You know, like in perspective, something's always exaggerated or something's always hidden. And, you know, for the simplest thing that we're looking at to work the way it works, it would have to, you know, if it was two-dimensional, cover sometimes 40 feet in space, or, you know, so that was, all this was being rediscovered.
Okay, interesting.
And then I think as people were walking through the space and it started to get erased, and there was some really interesting feedback also that came from this show, where people who had no idea what the piece was about would come in and say it reminded them of being in a childhood home. And I asked why, and they said, oh, because, you know, everything seems a little bit smaller than it should. Like when you're a grown up and you go back to the space and you realize, oh, that's how small this room actually was. So yeah, that's this project.
That's a reversal of scale and size.
I'm sorry?
A reversal of scale and size. When you are little, things look larger. When you grow up,
Exactly.
things. Yeah, sure. Next, please.
Okay, and this is the Kochi Biennale in 2014. And this is a similar technique in the sense that there are all these different fragments that then line up from one vantage point to create the illusion of a particular space. This piece became more about, you know, shared history. So more about the history of Kerala rather than my personal history and memory. And this is a 70-foot room, and I basically got these giant scrolls of paper. They're all about maybe 12 feet long, and most of them around 5 feet wide, and they were placed on the floor and hanging. And on each one of them, there are all these different images that are either painted and drawn or projected as an animation. And the drawings that you see here are, you know, like the drawings of the plants and the trees, for example, all that foliage is actually based on this encyclopedia called the Hortus Malabaricus, which is an encyclopedia of like 720 plant varieties from the Kerala area that the Dutch colonists created in the 17th century when they came. So all these plants are actually taken literally from there, with the exception that I have skewed them and splattered them and broken them and fractured them so that they will line up to create that illusion from that vantage point. And there were all these different animations in the project as well that were projected onto to interact with these drawings in certain places. And so there's an animation towards the front of the room where basically I, you know, so I'd asked an astrologer about where all the constellations were on May 20th, 1498 in Calicut, which is like that historic moment where Vasco da Gama arrived on his Portuguese sailing ship and so sort of like this destined moment in the stars for a whole new history of colonization to begin. And so there's an animation that kind of deals with those star constellations and the coming of the ship. There's another one where there's Vasco da Gama and the Samudri Raja exchanging gold and pepper. There's another one based on the Surya Siddhant, which is a 4th century text from Kerala, which had really poetic imagery and that had planets moving in seas of milk and wine, etc. So as the viewer walks through, you kind of see these little fractured fragments of Kerala's history. And then as you come to the front, we can go to the next slide. As you come to the front of the room, it actually all lines up together to create the illusion of like this open manuscript book. And you appear in this book as sort of the latest character in Kerala's history. And you see yourself on this little screen held up by this angel-like figure. And the screen itself is in the form of a book. And because the projector and the camera are actually facing each other, you get a book within a book within a book within a book. So it goes on. It's like an infinity of books within that. So you keep appearing as this, like a fractal. And at the back of the room, so this animation right in front that you can see, which is kind of lit up, is the one with the star constellations and the ship. And then in the back of the room, actually, when you first enter the room, what you first see is this table with a tiny book. And as you look into the book, it actually has light projection coming from the front of the room. So you see these sort of birds flying and ships moving and stars moving, but you also see characters walking through the book. And then you turn around, you enter the installation, then you become part of the book as well. So could we have the next one? It is a video. I don't know how well it's going to work, but we can try. Maybe we can just see the first minute of the video or something. Okay, I think maybe we can stop the video. It's a little jumpy, but again, this is also all on the website if anyone wants to see the video.
But it's interesting to see how you have, even in these works, you are very interested in creating environments, creating immersive environments, which people would enter, get lost, move around, find their way, come in, go somewhere else, see something that will surprise them, then go behind. It's very interesting. It's very different from what we see at KNMA currently, but
Right.
the idea of immersion is very, very much there.
Right.
This has much more innocent play, I would say, for the viewers, in terms of surprises waiting and, being able to see things together while they are fragmented, but how each one can piece their world as they move around.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Next one.
Ah.
This is what I'm very keen to know more about this work.
Sure. So this was a project I did for the Vancouver Biennale. Same year as I did the Kochi Biennale, 2014, and they're two very different projects. So I, like Aisha, I've also been interested in breath for a really long time. And partly because I have a meditation practice, and a large part of that has been about following the breath and watching the space between the breaths and the inhale and the exhale, and many such things. And I was invited to participate in the Vancouver Biennale, and the title of this was Cross Borders. And it was open to interpretation. You could do culturally cross borders, you could do, however you wanted to think about that. So for me, I was actually thinking about breath. This project is called Breath Song, because I was thinking about breath as being that thing that, of course, crosses borders. It goes in. It's leaving my, the exhale is leaving my body and entering the body. It's, my dog sitting in the next room, and then the tree and the bird and someone else. And so it's sort of moving between all living forms. And also, like in yoga, they talk about it moving between your astral body and your physical body. So, and we all, we've all at some point experimented with, the control that breath has on the physical body, the mind and the breath and the body, and how it moves between, these different worlds of thought and physicality. So I wanted to do something with breath. And what sort of sealed the deal for me in a way, because I really, I get a lot of inspiration from sight and from history and from what has happened there. And sometimes it's more about the inner space and that subtler place, but often it's also about what's outside. And in this case, I was given a choice to either do this project in Vancouver in the city, or to do it in a city called Squamish, which was 70 kilometers out of Vancouver. And I found out that Squamish, the word, it meant mother of the wind. And when I heard that, I felt like, oh, I really do have to do something with breath and air and wind now, because this is, it's in the title of the city itself. So what I did for this project, maybe we can go to the next slide. So I invited 108 residents of Squamish to let me record the sound of their breath. So they would come into the studio, or I would go to their car or their studio or wherever, the school. There were also young kids who participated with a microphone. And then, the participant would come in, and then they were just asked to internalize, close their eyes, and breathe. And there was no instructions on how to breathe. It could be a regular breath, it could be a agitated breath, it could be a loud breath, deep breath, whatever. And the other thing I'd requested was that while they were breathing, to just be aware of any word or thought or phrase that would come into the mind, and maybe like to share that, to write that down in their own handwriting. So the next slide, please. So I got a diary full of these words and phrases, and and some of them were really beautiful, and some of them were really violent, and there was a whole spectrum of words. And then what I did was I took all these words together that people had written, and I actually composed all of them into a poem. So I put them all together. And to give visual form to this poem, next slide, I basically created these images where it would look like, when our breath condenses on a cold pane of glass, and that it fogs up, and then you write a word in it. So it's this sort of visual form of breath. so I traced out everybody's handwritings, and then I made this poem so that it would appear like word by word or phrase by phrase in this visual of, condensed breath. And next slide. Yeah, this was my process of writing all my words down and jumbling them together to make the poem. Next. And then I created this screen, which was basically like 3 layers of plexiglass that I'd sanded so that it looked a little bit like a cloud. Next scene. And then basically I took the sound of everybody's breath and I layered it together to create this sort of like a breath symphony, which is sort of a fancy word because it is simpler than that. But this like symphony of breath sounds and rhythms. And it moved in rhythm to the poem that was coming, phrase by phrase. And so this poem was projected onto this cloud and accompanied with the sound of this breath song. So it was about a 12-minute piece finally. And people that participated, they were mostly, the audience was mostly people that had already participated in the project. Next. Yeah, and that's sort of what it looked like. Next.
Okay.
Okay. So again, this body of work is more related to the current body of work I'm doing with thread. It started in end of 2015, I think. So it's been about 6 years. So my mother passed away in 2013, and a few years later, I found her letters that she'd written to me, and they were lying in a box in my studio. And I was rereading them. And I had this impulse to embroider these letters, to trace her handwriting and embroider these words. So my mother was an incredible embroiderer, and she always tried to teach me, and I didn't really, I didn't really take to it much. I did a bit of cross stitch, but that was it. And so I was slightly surprised at this impulse to embroider, but I've learned to trust these impulses now. And so I traced out her letter and I started to embroider these words on a fabric. And as I did it, towards the end of doing this, I started to become aware that the reason I felt like embroidering this, apart from it being like an homage to her love for embroidery, was also I somehow wanted to tie these words to the ground, the fabric, because it was like, if you could write a word, you could just erase it. But somehow if you were embroidering the word, it was just really clinging to the ground. Like it was so hard to kind of, take it out. And so I did that. And when I finished, it felt like, the letter was protesting. It felt like her words were protesting, and it felt like they didn't actually want to cling to the ground, and they wanted to somehow float and be free and levitate and be permeated with space. And so then I re-embroidered the letter on a kind of transparent fabric, and I thought maybe this will work, but it still didn't feel right. So then I started cutting all the fabric out, and that was a mess. And then I invited, her embroiderer to come work with me in the studio full time. She used to embroider clothes and things, and when he came in, he told me, Didi, what you're looking for is there is this water soluble material like that we use to stabilize embroidery. And maybe if you want, we can try embroidering on that, and maybe you can dissolve it and see. And so that's what we did. We embroidered on this water soluble fabric, and then we put it into water, and the fabric disappeared, and we just left with the thread. And I also really loved this process of, just letting that ground, the support that was used to create something be dissolved. And so from after this letter, I also started to embroider all these like plant forms that were often pressed and sent in the letters to me. And she was also an incredible gardener, by the way. And in all the different houses we lived in all over the country, you know, we always had this magical garden that we'd come home to, and people always wanted to move into our house when we'd left because of the garden she'd created and left behind. And so the garden was a very important part of her. So this show was actually called In the Garden, and it ended up, part of it ended up becoming this sort of skeletal archive of memory of the garden. And there was other parts to this show too, but I haven't included those slides. So maybe we'll move on. Yeah. And I wanted this language of memory, you know, this sort of black and white and porous and skeletal and not three-dimensional, but almost like something that's been preserved between the pages of a book, like it's flattened out. And like stories also sometimes get two-dimensional in our heads over time. And I wanted that in it. Next slide, please. Yeah. So these are all different pieces in the show. Next.
Yeah.
Okay, and this comes to the KNMA show. And this show is titled 33. I mean, this project is titled 33 Link Road. And has the thread drawing been removed of the gate in paper, Priya?
I don't see it. Maybe
Anyway,
the next
maybe
one?
we'll find it later.
Is it the
But
next one?
basically,
is it the next one? No. Okay. So
no,
it's not.
I think it's gone. But that's okay. So this is so going back to 33 Link Road, my grandparents' home, which was, you know, sort of home for us for years. This home was actually built by them very soon after partition, when they moved from Pakistan to India. And they were refugees for a while, living in tents and then in a school in Dehradun. And then a few years later, they got this land in Lajpat Nagar. And, you know, they built this house room by room, brick by brick, as and when they could afford it. And this house, of course, is the, you know, container of all these childhood memories. And my mother was actually born in this house before there were windows installed in this house. In the back room, my grandfather's died in this house. My cousins have been married in this house. We've had all our sleepovers and pajama parties in this house.
Sumakshi, we've lost you. I think by the time we come to this project, there is an emphasis on emptiness, on dematerialization of matter, everything turning, you know, I mean, there is only a spectral presence left of the house. And I think one would like to hear from Sumakshi about this whole idea of illusion, shadows, specters. Yes, Sumakshi? Can't hear you. Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. So I was just talking about, by this time, in this project especially, we see emptiness, we see dematerialization of matter, we see a very spectral presence, and we would like to hear from you about it, because you were talking about those memories, and how shadows carry those memories. Maybe you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think that, for the first time in 72 years, this house is now empty. And so I wanted to, I wanted to recreate the facades of this house in a way that it made it almost ghost-like, like a specter, like something like a mirage, something insubstantial, considering the form and the meaning of home as something that was just, shimmering and disappearing in a way. And I also wanted to do it in thread because of, like I said, the association I had, that for me, it was about, my grandmother embroidering in the sun, and something, feminine and labor intensive and intimate, like fabric and thread are so intimate, like our skin touches it every day. And yeah, so it was about that. It was about the mirage of home and the dematerialization. And they almost seem X-ray like in the space, this white on white. They're backlit, so they come out almost as these silhouettes. And it was interesting because I did one version of this, not the entire thing, but I did a few of these pieces based on memory. And then I managed to get keys to the house. And so I went in to measure everything. And, when I measured them, every hinge, every nut, every bolt, and then I realized, okay, one is 9.3 inches and one is 9.1 inch. And everything, there were all these idiosyncrasies throughout the space, which I think because the house wasn't built in one go. But when I remade the pieces based on the actual measurements, the strange thing was that the pieces are made from memory to date still feel more accurate to me than the ones that are based on the accurate measurements. So I think it was an interesting, an interesting space. And I think actually a lot of the work has that in common in terms of my bodies of work and also some of the other artists in the show, that they are an invitation into a sort of silent space. And sometimes the space is silent because it's like the aftermath of an event. So you're in that, maybe the dissolution of it or something. And then sometimes it's silent because it's like this information-rich space of potential, like just before the world has been crystallized by a perception. Just before that polarity happens, where you have background, foreground, object, image, physical illusion, physical object, illusory object. Before those polarities come in, when they're still slightly more integrated in this kind of more muddy territory, and we haven't yet named, categorized, framed, formed. And so you're still in that place of anything can become anything. And it requires a kind of slowing down to walk through it, to breathe, all of that. So
next, please. Yeah, we have some images. Yeah. The shadows play a very important role here. In fact, most viewers, when they come, they think this is drawn on the wall, but actually it's the shadow of the threads, of the thread. So you can...
because some of the pieces are directly on the wall. They're just like an inch away from the wall surface.
Yeah.
So they just seem to be hovering like these ghosts in space. And maybe the next slide might have an image of that.
The staircase.
And the staircase, and they register just through the shadow, actually. Sorry, not maybe the next slide. Or the next.
But there is the shadow.
This one. Like these. Yeah, so it's actually, it's true, like a lot of the pieces themselves become invisible, and you only know them because of the effect, because where they block the light is how they articulate their form.
It also becomes an ethereal space, because of absences, but yet, very much the abandoned house. Next.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted it to be a space, you can play it, that's fine.
Yeah.
I wanted it to be a space where it, just felt like these veils of memory that were, sometimes there were these overlaps and there was confusion, and other times you had very clear vantage points, but all of it just felt sort of porous and ghost-like, yeah.
But it's very interesting how, Aisha, in your work, both there is there is an emphasis on fragility. Okay. But there is also resilience of some kind in the way the structure holds them, So there is fragility, but there is also resilience expected. Like she works with paper. She does a lot to the paper. Paper is a fragile surface. And she cuts it, she assembles it, she pieces it, she folds it, she precisely puts them together. And it just becomes resilient, in the way it is treated, in the way that she works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed that too. I also noticed that similarity in or the insensibility of this tension between the the fragile, but also like the fact that her paper often looks like metal, this hard, strong surface, but it's actually this fragile thing. And same with the architecture that I'm working with, this something that's hard, solid, supposed to hold and protect your body, but it's actually this completely, fragile material. And so maybe that security is in the concept and not in its physicality. So yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sumakshi and Aisha, both of you. I think this was really a very beautiful evening for me. I can say for me, you just evoked so many emotions in me and such memories. Some of the memories resonate with all of us. Have been through loss. We have witnessed death of our family members. We have all lived with memories and ghosts and hopes and and sadness in a way, when I think we lose. But I think at the end of it, there is light, because in both these works, there is a presence of light. I mean, I see that even in Aisha's room, when I see the shimmer of her works, I see it in your pristine environment, something so ethereal and airy and light. And so do I see in Lala, Rukh and Prabhavathi as well. So thank you so much. And how are we doing on time? Priya, have we crossed our time limit as always? Priya?
Yes, we're 2 hours in.
Okay. Are there any questions, or or do we do that later? If there are any questions, we collect those and send them to the artists. Shall we do that? Just to add to this, that this exhibition is still on and the museum has opened up. It's reopened after 10 months, almost after 8 months. And so anybody who has not seen this exhibition, I would urge you to see the exhibition if possible. It's going to be up till March 20th, I think, is the last date. So please visit the exhibition at KNMA Saket. It's really a beautiful exhibition, I would say myself, because I go there and I'm literally in a space that is beautiful in terms of, it just mesmerizes me how these artists have created these works. And we have seen today that their practice is much more than what you see at KNMA. So do follow them, and they are artists to watch in the future. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, all the viewers, for being there. Thank you, Avigna, Priya, Jijo, Hari, all of you for making this possible. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Aishi.
you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks a
Roobina.
lot. Yeah.